It was the day before my first concert as a new instrumental music educator in a small town in southern Wisconsin. We were working on a piece called Portrait of a Clown, and it wasn't going well. The band kept falling apart. We didn't sound like any band you've probably ever heard. I called my father, a veteran music educator, for some last-minute advice, and he said, "Chris, pull out the music and write an introduction. Give it to one of your students to read before the concert. Crowd will love that." So dutifully, I took out my music and I wrote an introduction. The next evening, the band was assembled on stage, and I gave the introduction to one of my students to read, and she walked up to the microphone and said something like this: "Welcome to our concert this evening. Our first piece of music is called Portrait of a Clown by Frank DeKelly. It's written in ABA form, and it portrays the life of a clown, both the serious and not so serious moments." And then she paused. She looked over at me, and then turned back and said into the microphone, "Oh, that's what the piece is about." It was a devastating moment. I felt the collective gaze of hundreds of eyes staring out at me, and corner of my eye could see the exit sign. I was going to make a break for it. Later that night, Dad calls me and goes, "How'd it go?" "Horrible." I said, "I can't teach. Look, the band fell apart. We had to start over. Some kids didn't show up. But the worst thing is that the students didn't even know what they were performing. They had no clue. And I was heartbroken. This was my first concert. This is what I had wanted to do. But it was so traumatic. I mean, if anyone should have a chance at this, it should have been me. I mean, my father was a band director, you know? My brother is a band director. I married a band director, right? My mom has a doctorate in education. Someone should be able to do this, but it's farthest from the truth. In fact, the year went poorly the rest of the year. In fact, this was my first marching band. I told them to wear long pants and to tuck in their shirts. It got to the end of the year, and I didn't quite know what else to do. I decided I was going to quit the teaching profession, and at the last moment, I took a workshop. And at the workshop, I met these amazing music educators. One pulled me aside, and I remember what she said. She goes, "Chris, it's not the feeling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire." It's a quote by Yeats. And as I thought about that, there were no fires being lit in my classroom. In fact, I felt like this, like I had a hose and I was dousing children. You like learning? I can put that out for you. For the past 22 years, I've worked hard to light a fire in my kids, to challenge them to go deeper inside themselves, to play above themselves, to realize more fully their individual and collective potential. But how do we light a fire in kids? My students have taught me 3 truths about teaching and learning. The first is that we need to cultivate curiosity. We need to nurture intrinsic motivation, and we need to create connections. Let me share with you a story about cultivating curiosity. Class started that day with a heightened sense of anticipation and excitement. The students filed in, and with their instruments and music, they also had a project. Now, Curtis was the first to go. He stood up, presented his ideas, and afterwards the kids clapped and wrote down some notes. Then it was Sierra's turn, and she stood up slowly with a certain reverence and turned and faced the ensemble and then said, "I believe the idea that for the piece should be about Georgia O'Keeffe. She's one of the most famous female artists that has ever lived, and she was born in the town that we're being raised in." And then she paused, and with a bit more emotion, she continued, "And what people don't realize is that she went blind during her life, but she remained an artist. Her determination to live out her dream is something we can all learn from." It was a stunning moment. You see, 10 years ago, I asked my students a rather audacious question. I said, if we could have a composer write a piece of music for us, what would it be about? Well, with the help of internationally renowned composer Samuel R. Hazel, we found this painting by Georgia O'Keeffe called Blue and Green Music. Now, Georgia O'Keeffe painted this while listening to some unknown piece of music. Our challenge to composer Hazel was to put this back into something for the ear. Now, as we were preparing, I asked my students, what are some things we should learn about Georgia O'Keeffe? What do we know? Curious, they hopped on the internet and hopped on their bikes to find out more. They rode their bikes to our town center, and they found a cow statue painted in O'Keeffe fashion. They rode 2 miles out of town to find her birthplace. Through their research, they found out that the composer, Sam Hazel, and Georgia O'Keeffe share the same birthday. They also found out that Grandpa O'Keefe founded the Catholic school in town and is buried in the cemetery next to our school. We also realized that the mayor at the time was an O'Keefe expert. He traveled with us to go see some of the vistas in which she painted, on the way to the Milwaukee Art Museum to see some of her work. But nothing was as profound as the world premiere performance of Georgia O'Keeffe's Blue and Green Music. And the thing was, we were there at our state music convention. The students were on stage, the composer was conducting, some of the artwork was right in front of us, and seated in the front row, some of Georgia O'Keeffe's relatives, arm in arm, listening to this music with a tear in their eye. At the end of the performance, students didn't want to leave the stage. A fire was burning inside of them. This project had piqued their curiosity and awakened their imaginations. It had awoken something inside of them. As educators, we need to harness and cultivate the curiosity inside our students already. Research shows that young children are naturally curious. In fact, a recent study found that young children ask on average 73 questions a day. That's 500 questions a week. Am I right, parents? With this, our children bring with them to school often a fire that's already lit. It's our job to nurture and protect that fire, much like a farmer with his or her crops. Sir Ken Robinson put it like this: farmers know you can't make the plant grows itself. What you do is to provide the conditions for growth. Great farmers know what the conditions are, and the bad ones don't. Great teachers know what the conditions are, and the bad ones don't. I believe the conditions for growth needs to start by asking this question: what does this child need? Our obsession with standardized test scores and data paints a very narrow view of human intelligence, and it also puts a stranglehold on teachers. We need to realize that numbers and letters can never summarize the learning that takes place in our classroom. There is no test in the world that can measure what matters most important in life. And I believe that all begins with curiosity. The second truth my students taught me, and that's nurturing intrinsic motivation. Back to my classroom, my first year. The students were filing in, and I announced to them, students, time to turn in your practice charts. Now wait, did a cold shiver just run down your spine? That's right, musicians, you know what I'm talking about. These are like calendars, and you would write in your practice minutes, right? And at the bottom, they're placed for your parent or guardian to sign. Well, I was collecting these and walking along, and I saw Billy feverishly writing in 20, 20, 20, 20, 20, 20. And then with me in front of him, forged his father's signature. With a triumphant, aha, I grabbed his sheet, and I said, follow me. And we went into my office, I called his father. I said, sir, Billy here just filled out his practice chart in front of me, and he forged your signature. To which the father replied, no, I did that this morning. I learned at a very early age in my teaching career that I could not make my students practice. I couldn't make them take their instruments home. I couldn't make them come to the concert. Yeah, and I tried all the tricks I knew. I started with fear and intimidation, and when that didn't work, I quickly went to coercion, manipulation, and incentivizing them. Oh yeah, I used everything. Candy bars, band bucks, baked goods. I mean, one night I was baking a batch of cookies. My wife looked at me and she goes, what are you doing? And I said, teaching? Now, admittedly, some of these extrinsic motivators did work with some of the students some of the time, but here's what I noticed. The quality of their products continued to go down while the cost of business continued to go up. I profess and I believe in this idea that we can embrace nurturing intrinsic motivation by promoting three things: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Autonomy meaning the desire to direct our own lives, to make some choices. Mastery meaning the desire to get better at something that matters to us. And purpose meaning finding relevance, right? Something more enduring than ourselves. This reminds me of a challenge I posed to my band recently. We were working on a piece called Moscow 1941 by Brian Bomages. And in that, I was telling this group of seventh graders, the German army was within 15 miles of Moscow, but they pushed them back 300 miles. How'd they do it? Little seventh graders talk, and they came up with collaboration, teamwork, community. Said exactly. I want you to go out into our school and find something you want to make better. Find others in community with you. Create an action plan. Enact your action plan, gather data, and bring it back. Can you see 7th graders writing that down? Action plan. But amazing things happened. This one group called themselves the sit-down group. Their goal? To find the students that sat alone at lunch and make friends with them. I was out at lunch watching this take place, and my principal walked up and said, "Chris, what's going on?" I said, "Band." "Band? It's lunchtime." "Right, Moscow 1941. It's like, I don't get it. After I explained it to him, I think he gave me a hug. You see, I told him at that point, I don't teach music, I teach through music. It's my discipline of choice. Today we're learning community. I believe that these kids didn't do this for a grade because there was no grade assigned. They did it because they felt some autonomy, some choice. They saw relevance, they saw mastery. I believe we need to work with kids instead of doing things to them. We need to excite them into engagement rather than to coerce them into compliance. Thank you. My third truth, my students taught me. I want you to recall the teacher who made the biggest impact in your life. Can you close your eyes just for a moment? Picture that person. What do you remember most about that person? What's the most important thing they taught you? Now, I'm going to bet the most important thing they taught you will never show up on a standardized test. It's the connection made. People will forget what you said, they will forget what you did, but they'll never forget the way you made them feel. Maya Angelou. Our students are beautifully diverse and distinct. Inside every child is a story and a narrative yet to unfold. It's our job as educators to connect with those students and to help them find their passions. One of my students taught that to me recently. It was closing in on the end of the school year. I had just pulled up to the parking lot, and before I even got out of my car, there were 3 students waiting for me. The first says, "Mr. Gleason, someone put their clarinet in my locker, in my trumpet locker." The second said, "Mr. Gleason, I have second clarinet parts. I would like first clarinet parts." And the third was there as a bodyguard or something, I don't know. 15 minutes later, after negotiating and de-escalating the situation, I make it into my classroom, okay? Within first 5 minutes of class, fire drill. Yeah, right. And then an assembly. Wait for it. And then a tornado drill. It was one of those days, right? I got to the end of the day, I'm exhausted. There's a knock on the door. In walks Loretta. She says, "Mr. Gleason, can I get a lesson?" "Sure, Loretta, come on in." She sits down, we're working on some things, and then about halfway through, she stops and says, "Do you want to hear what I'm going to do this summer?" And I looked at her and looked her right in the eye and said, "No." Teacher of the year. No. Look, I was exhausted, right? It was one of those days. I apologize. I said, "How about tomorrow?" But you know what? It never happened. 3 weeks later, I'm here. I'm in Huntsville, Alabama at Space Camp with the 27 Teachers of the Year. And Ed Buckby, the founder of Space Camp, is giving us a talk. And at one point he stops and says, "How old was Neil Armstrong when he stepped foot on the moon?" We took some guesses, and he said 39. He said, "How old are your high school seniors?" We're like 18, 19? He goes, "Right. We're going to Mars in 20 years. Now, I didn't figure it out right away. I was doing the math. Took me a minute. But then as soon as I did, he said these words, "You're teaching the next Neil Armstrong." I was flying back home, and I got back, and I was thinking about Loretta in that day, and I emailed her, and I said, "Loretta, I'm so sorry. I never even caught up with you on that. What did you end up doing this summer?" She sent me a picture. She said, "I went to Space Camp. I want to be the next Neil Armstrong." We can never underestimate the beauty inside our children, and it's up to us to make those connections. I had the privilege and honor of watching my father teach for years. And the thing that I noticed is that his dedication and perseverance left no room for you to question that he was committed to your success. I mean, he would teach a long day, and at the end of it, he would say, "Come here." And he'd teach you a lesson for 45 minutes, and then afterwards, tap you on the shoulder and say, "Good, now come back tomorrow, we'll do it again." I saw him for the last time about a week before his passing, and I was in the ICU with my iPad, and I had a video of my son, 9 years old, playing tuba with the high school pep band. the look of pride on his face. At the funeral, my brother, my mom, and I were in front of a long line of former students who had come to pay respects to a man who made a profound difference in their lives. Behind me, a brass ensemble consisting of former students and my 9-year-old son playing Grandpa's tuba. It was in that moment when I realized, when it all crystallized, the lifelong impact we have as educators. It was a few days later when we were packing up some things, and I noticed a picture of my father. It was with him marching with his band in Arcadia, and underneath it an inscription that said, "What nobler profession than to touch the next generation, to see children hold your understanding in their eyes, your hope in their lives, your world in their hands. In their success you find your own, and so to them you give your all." By nurturing intrinsic motivation, cultivating curiosity, and making connections, we can light a fire in kids. Thank you.